Alara moved with a quiet, almost reverent precision through the narrow aisles of the wax cylinder, her fingers, slender and dusted with the fine grit of old paper, tracing the spines of vinyl sleeves. The air in the Soho record shop hung heavy, a rich, complex perfume of forgotten album art, the faint, sweet decay of cardboard, and the metallic tang of dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the grimy front window. Outside, the perpetual rumble of London traffic provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant, keening wail of a siren, a sound as much a part of the city's fabric as the cobblestones beneath its ancient buildings. She wore a faded band t-shirt, not punk, not new wave, but something from an earlier era, its cotton soft with countless washes, a worn testament to a sound she felt a profound, almost aching connection to. It was a relic, much like many of the records she tended, and it whispered of harmonies and rebellion that felt pure, untainted by the slick gloss of the current charts. Her gaze, a deep, thoughtful hazel, lingered on the iconic Sgt. Pepper album cover, its vibrant collage a portal to a time she'd only ever experienced through crackling speakers and grainy photographs. A quiet longing settled in her chest, a yearning for a purity she imagined existed in that bygone music, a world where the messages felt simpler, the emotions more direct. She imagined the scent of patchouli and the sound of laughter, a freedom that felt just out of reach in the grittier, more cynical London of the late 70s. Liam, her flatmate and colleague, a lean young man whose dark hair defied gravity in a carefully cultivated mess, leaned against a display of new releases, a look of theatrical disdain fixed on his face. He chewed slowly on a stick of gum, his jaw working with deliberate slowness. "Another bloody disco record," he muttered, his voice a low growl, gesturing with a flick of his chin towards a woman at the counter. Her purse clutched tight, a glittery 12-inch single already in her hands. He caught Alara's eye across the aisle, a smirk playing on his lips, a familiar challenge. "Still lost in the age of flower power, Vance? You're a walking anachronism, you know that? We're living in the future, darling, not some hazy summer of love." Alara merely offered a small, knowing smile, a slight tilt of her head that acknowledged his barb without truly accepting it. She didn't bother to reply, knowing the futility of arguing musical tastes with Liam. Instead, she returned to her task, her fingers resuming their gentle journey along the rows of obscure folk and forgotten rock. Their banter was a comfortable, well-worn path, a small, predictable rhythm in the daily hum of the shop. A grizzled man, Arthur Finch, perhaps in his mid-50s, browsed the classical section with the focused intensity of a scholar poring over ancient texts. His tweed jacket, frayed at the cuffs and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and damp wool, seemed to carry the weight of countless forgotten stories within its fibers. He was a regular, a silent fixture, always selecting obscure classical compositions or deep-cut jazz albums, his choices always impeccable, never swayed by popular trends. He rarely spoke, offering only a curt nod when Alara tallied his purchases, his eyes, dark and intelligent, always seeming to look right through her. Today, he merely grunted a greeting, a low sound from deep in his throat, as she passed him, his attention already consumed by a rare pressing of a Sibelius symphony. As Alara sorted through a box of recent trade-ins, a motley collection of forgotten pop singles and scratched LPs, her fingers brushed against something unusual. It was a 7-inch single, heavier than most, with a blank white label that felt oddly smooth beneath her thumb. A crudely drawn apple, faded with age and a faint yellowing, occupied the very center, surrounded by a series of cryptic initials. JLPMGHRS. Below them, almost an afterthought, was a date, 69. A strange, undeniable pull emanated from the unassuming disc, a faint vibration that seemed to resonate in the quiet of the shop. It felt old, significant, imbued with a silent history that hummed just beneath the surface, a secret waiting to be told. She held it, turning it over in her hands, the weight almost unsettling. Liam, who had drifted closer, ever curious, glanced over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of dismissal. Probably some dodgy bootleg from the market, Vance. Seen 100 like it. Some chancer trying to flog off a demo. Bin it. He waved a dismissive hand, already turning back to eye a new shipment of imported reggae. Alara, however, ignored him completely. A prickle of intuition, sharp and insistent, guided her. Her fingers tightened around the single. There was something in the crude apple, in the faded initials, in the sheer weight of the vinyl, that spoke to her in a language beyond Liam's cynicism. She tucked the record carefully into a plastic sleeve, placing it aside, a quiet defiance settling in her gaze. Later that evening, the damp air of Alara's small Camden flat clung to her like a second skin, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the canal outside her window. Posters of Bowie, a vibrant Ziggy Stardust, and a smoldering Mark Bolan of T-Rex adorned the walls, sharing space with a framed print of the Abbey Road crossing, a constant reminder of her musical pilgrimage, a sacred site she visited often in her mind. The flat was a sanctuary, a cluttered haven filled with books and records and the quiet hum of her small, second-hand life. She carefully placed the mysterious 7-inch on her cheap, second-hand turntable, its plastic plinth scarred with countless scuffs, the belt drive sometimes prone to a slight, rhythmic wobble. Her heart thumped a nervous rhythm against her ribs, a quickening pulse that belied the stillness of the room. The ritual was always the same, a moment of anticipation before the sound. She lifted the tone arm, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest, and lowered the needle gently into the groove. A hiss of static, a familiar crackle, then a raw, acoustic guitar riff, simple yet utterly distinctive, filled the room. It was unmistakably Lennon-esque, rough, unfinished, a demo perhaps, but undeniably potent, vibrating with an urgent, unpolished energy. The chords felt like a punch to the gut, familiar yet completely new. Then, a voice, soft and melancholic, singing a melody she'd never heard, accompanied by harmonies that resonated with a familiar, almost painful beauty, a sound woven into the very fabric of her being. It was haunting, imperfect, a raw, exposed nerve of sound, but undeniably them. The air in the small room seemed to thicken, holding its breath, as if the very walls recognized the impossible echo. The scent of instant noodles, a faint, metallic tang, hung in the air of the small kitchen. Liam, leaning over the hob, stirred the pale, swirling concoction with a plastic fork, his face a mask of bored resignation. The tinny sound of Alara's record player, perched precariously on a stack of encyclopedias in the living room, drifted in. He rolled his eyes, a familiar gesture. More old man music, Alara? You'll be asking for a bingo card next. His voice was laced with its usual dry sarcasm, a protective shell he rarely shed. Alara, perched on the edge of the sofa, didn't even look up, lost in the crackle and hiss of the 7-inch. Then, a snatch of the melody, a particular guitar riff, clean and surprisingly intricate, cut through the background noise. Liam's hand, mid-stir, paused. His head tilted almost imperceptibly, a frown creasing his brow. He listened, really listened, for a moment longer than he usually would. Alara glanced at him, a flicker of apprehension mixed with a fragile hope. His cynical gaze, usually so quick to dismiss, held a subtle, uncharacteristic flicker of surprise. He cleared his throat, pushing the noodles around in the pot. "All right," he mumbled, not looking at her, "it's different. I'll give you that." He shrugged, a small, almost involuntary movement, as if admitting even that much was a physical effort. Alara felt a small, quiet victory bloom in her chest, a shared moment that bridged their usual playful antagonism. The next morning, a nervous energy thrummed beneath Alara's skin. The mysterious 7-inch, wrapped carefully in a silk scarf, felt like a live thing in her bag. Soho was a blur of noise and hurried footsteps, the pungent smell of exhaust fumes mixing with the faint, sweet scent of stale tobacco. She moved from one dusty record shop to another, her voice hushed with the reverence of a devotee as she presented her find. Most dealers, men with weary eyes and encyclopedic knowledge, dismissed it with a shake of the head. Fake, one grunted, barely glancing at the crude Apple label. Clever imitation, trying to cash in on the sound, another offered, polishing a rare jazz LP. Probably a forgotten demo by some lesser-known band, hoping to fool a few punters. Alara's shoulders slumped with each rejection, a cold wave of disappointment washing over her, yet the conviction in her gut remained stubbornly intact. Then she stepped into Mr. Henderson's shop, a cramped, dimly lit cavern near Denmark Street, heavy with the scent of aged paper and vinyl. The air itself seemed to hum with forgotten melodies. Mr. Henderson, a man whose shop had seen the swinging 60s come and go, whose own memories stretched back further than most, was perched on a stool, sorting through a pile of scratched singles. His spectacles were perched low on his nose, and his hands, gnarled with age, moved slowly. Alara approached him, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and carefully laid the 7-inch on the counter. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the rough-cut edges of the label. He squinted at the crude apple, then at the handwritten date, 69. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant rumble of a bus. A flicker of recognition, faint but undeniable, crossed his weathered face. "Apple, eh?" he murmured, his voice raspy. "Bit late for that, isn't it? Thought they'd packed it in by 69, mostly." He paused, his gaze distant. "Though, I do recall talk. Rumors, really. About a lost tape. Something experimental, from the very late days. Before the final, bitter breakup." He looked up at Alara, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Mentioned a studio assistant, I think. Quiet fellow. Arthur Finch. Always at Applecore, meticulous, always in the background." The name, a forgotten echo, clicked in Alara's mind. Arthur. A tangible lead, a sudden, exhilarating surge of hope. She thanked him, her voice barely a whisper, the world outside the shop seeming to sharpen into focus once more. For days, the name Arthur Finch echoed in Alara's thoughts. She found herself waiting outside, the wax cylinder, after her shifts, braving the biting London wind, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of him. The impatience was a constant hum, a nervous energy that kept her on edge. Finally, one damp Tuesday, he appeared. He shuffled along the pavement, head down, shoulders hunched, a solitary figure lost in his own world, seemingly oblivious to the bustling city around him. He wore a threadbare overcoat, and his movements were slow, deliberate. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and approached him, holding the precious 7-inch like a sacred relic. "Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice a little too loud in the quiet evening air. I found this. It has an Apple label, dated 69. I was told you might know something about it. About Applecore, that time." Arthur stiffened, his shuffling gait coming to an abrupt halt. His eyes, usually vacant and distant, sharpened with a flicker of old pain, a raw, exposed nerve. He looked at the record, then at Alara, a sudden, almost hostile intensity in his gaze. "Nonsense," he dismissed her curtly, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the street noise. "Old stories. Leave it be." He made to walk away, his shoulders hunching further, a clear desire to escape. Desperate, Alara fumbled in her bag, pulling out her portable cassette player, a modern marvel for the era, a small, sleek gray box that felt alien in the old man's presence. With trembling fingers, she pressed play, and a snippet of the recording she dubbed from the 7-inch spilled out into the damp evening air. The raw, intimate sound of the music, the unmistakable voices, stopped Arthur dead. His face paled, the color draining from it as if he'd seen a ghost. His gaze, fixed on the cassette player, was intense, almost accusatory, a mixture of fear and anger. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper, laced with a tremor Alara hadn't heard before. He reached out, his hand surprisingly strong, and grabbed her arm, his grip tightening. "You don't know what you're dabbling with, girl. You don't understand the trouble this could bring." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken warnings. He released her just as abruptly, turning away, his shoulders hunched even more. He walked off, disappearing into the twilight, leaving Alara shaken, her arm throbbing, but more convinced than ever of the record's profound, dangerous significance. The cold knot of fear in her stomach was tempered by a fierce resolve. Word of Alara's unusual find, vague and unconfirmed, began to circulate like a whisper among the more niche collectors and dealers in London. It was a rumor, a hint, enough to catch the finely tuned ear of Marcus Thorne. He appeared at the Wax Cylinder a few days later, a smooth-talking man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place among the dusty shelves and stacks of vinyl. His expensive cologne, faint but distinct, cut through the shop's usual smell of paper and old plastic. He was known for dealing in high-end, often ethically dubious, music memorabilia, a man whose reputation preceded him in hushed tones. He bought a few expensive, rare items: a pristine first pressing of a forgotten psychedelic album, a signed copy of a punk single, making polite small talk with Liam, his eyes subtly probing the shop, assessing, searching. Any interesting recent acquisitions, perhaps something unique? He purred, his smile charmingly insincere. Liam, ever the cynic, shrugged, not even looking up from dusting a shelf. Only Alara's weird old record. Thinks it's the Holy Grail or something. He gestured vaguely towards the back of the shop. Marcus's eyes, for a split second, gleamed with a predatory flash, a flicker of cold calculation that Alara, watching from across the shop, barely registered, a fleeting unease she couldn't quite place. He then turned his attention to her, a different, more direct charm settling on his features. He offered Alara a business card, the paper thick and expensive, the lettering subtly embossed. "If you ever come across anything truly special, dear," he said, his voice a low, suggestive rumble, "my door is always open. And my wallet, considerably so." Alara felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the shop's draft. It was a premonition, a quiet alarm bell ringing in her gut. The feeling of urgency, the weight of the mysterious 7-inch growing heavier in her pocket, gnawed at Alara. She couldn't shake Marcus Thorne's polished menace, nor Arthur Finch's raw fear. She continued to press Arthur, finding his rundown flat in a forgotten corner of Battersea, a place that smelled of damp and old books, a faint, persistent mildew. The small rooms were crammed with archaic recording equipment, reel-to-reel players with their silent, waiting spools, and precarious stacks of classical records that seemed to lean precariously against the water-stained walls. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak afternoon light. She explained her fascination, her unwavering belief in the music's authenticity, her almost spiritual connection to the sound. Her voice, usually so clear, was earnest, pleading. Arthur, surrounded by the tangible ghosts of his past, finally let her in, albeit reluctantly. He shuffled deeper into the clutter, pulling an old armchair closer to a flickering electric heater. His initial gruffness softened, slowly, into a weary resignation as he began to recount a fragmented story, the words coming out in hesitant bursts, punctuated by long silences. He had been a junior engineer at Apple, a silent witness to the band's agonizing fracturing. He spoke of the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog, the unspoken words, the palpable sorrow. The recording, he explained, was a private session, a desperate, final attempt by Lennon and McCartney to work through their differences, raw and unpolished, filled with both discord and fleeting moments of fragile harmony. It was never meant for release, he whispered, his gaze distant, a deeply personal, almost painful document of their unraveling. Like watching two brothers tear each other apart, but still trying to hold on. He remembered the master tape being supposedly destroyed, a symbolic act of finality, a severing of ties. But then, his eyes, momentarily clouded by pain, sharpened. "But there was a rough mix," he murmured, almost to himself. "A copy. Made in secret. For a specific, now forgotten reason." He trailed off, shaking his head, the memory just out of reach. He initially refused to help her search for it. The memory's too painful, the potential repercussions too great. You don't understand, girl, he rasped, his voice full of a deep-seated fear. It's not just money. It's their souls. It's what they tried to keep private. Stirring that up, it's dangerous. It'll be twisted, exploited. They'll chew it up and spit it out. His hands, gnarled and trembling slightly, gripped the arms of his chair. Alara felt a pang of disappointment, but also a deep understanding of his reluctance. The weight of his past was heavy in the room. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne, a shadow in Alara's periphery, began to appear at the wax cylinder with alarming frequency. His visits, at first charmingly casual, slowly took on a menacing regularity. The charming facade he presented slowly eroded, revealing a steely determination beneath. He no longer pretended to browse, but would often stand near the counter, watching Alara, his eyes cold and assessing. He offered Alara increasingly large sums for the 7-inch, his words, initially polite, becoming laced with veiled threats. "That little record of yours," he purred one afternoon, his voice low enough that Liam, behind the counter, couldn't quite catch it. "It's more than just a bootleg, isn't it? Some people don't like their secrets dug up, dear. The music industry can be a very unforgiving place for naive young women who get in over their heads." His smile remained, but his eyes were hard, unwavering. Alara felt the pressure mount, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The initial thrill of the chase had turned into something menacing, something that felt like a trap closing in. She realized Marcus was not just an opportunistic dealer. He was a serious, dangerous threat, and she was very much alone. Shaken by Marcus's escalating pressure, the veiled threats echoing in her ears, Alara returned to Arthur's flat, almost running through the darkening streets of Battersea. She found him sitting in the same armchair, staring blankly at the wall. Her voice was breathless, tinged with a fear she hadn't dared to show before. She recounted Thorne's threats, the growing danger that now surrounded the precious recording. Arthur listened intently, his gaze fixed on her, the lines on his face deepening with each word. He saw a reflection of Alara's naive idealism in his own younger self, a flicker of the passion he once held. Perhaps, he thought, this was a chance to right a past wrong, or to protect a memory that had haunted him for decades, a legacy he had inadvertently guarded. A subtle shift occurred in him, a hardening of his jaw, a new resolve in his eyes. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "The secret copy," he revealed, "it wasn't the 7-inch. That was just a rough cut, a quickly pressed acetate. The real copy. It was a reel-to-reel tape." He paused, a painful memory surfacing. "I gave it to a mutual friend. George Davies, a sound engineer. He left Apple shortly after that session, couldn't stand the pressure anymore. Said he was moving to the countryside, somewhere quiet, away from it all." Arthur's eyes glazed over slightly, remembering. "We had our last drink at the Loudspeaker, a pub near Abbey Road. A small place, usually full of studio types. He disappeared after that. Never heard from him again." He looked at Alara, a new light in his eyes. "I'll help you find it," he said, the words heavy with his newfound commitment. "But only on one condition. If we find that tape, it must be handled with respect. Not sold off to the highest bidder, not exploited for profit. It's too important for that. It belongs to the music, not to them." Alara nodded, a silent promise passing between them, a fragile alliance forged in the face of shared danger. Arthur meticulously digitized a short, carefully chosen snippet of the recording, his movements precise and deliberate in the quiet of his flat. The old reel-to-reel machine whirred softly, a familiar, comforting sound in the hushed room, as he threaded the magnetic tape with practiced ease. Alara watched him from the armchair, a mug of now cold tea cupped in her hands, the weight of the past and the future pressing down on her. The chosen passage was a fragile, almost ethereal guitar intro, a melody that swelled with a hint of what could have been, before fading into a delicate, understated harmony. It was beautiful, undeniably and unmistakably them, yet it was devoid of the raw, exposed nerves that laced the rest of the album. It was a ghost of a memory, a whisper of a dream. He worked for hours, transferring the chosen few minutes to a master cassette tape, then meticulously making several copies on a separate, older deck. Each click and whir of the machines seemed to punctuate the silence, a testament to the analog age they inhabited. Alara felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy as the process unfolded. This wasn't the grand, sweeping release she had once envisioned, the one that would shake the music world. This was something far more intimate, more respectful. It was a secret handshake to those who remembered, a quiet nod to a legacy. They decided to release it anonymously. A single, unmarked cassette tape slipped into the post to a revered independent music magazine known for its deep cuts and discerning taste, along with a cryptic, typewritten note about a final echo from the lost sessions. Another copy was sent, just as anonymously, to a late-night radio DJ in Manchester, known for championing obscure artists and forgotten gems. They wanted it to find its way organically, a subtle current in the vast ocean of sound, rather than a crashing wave. It was Arthur's quiet rebellion, Alara's heartfelt compromise. A few weeks later, the phone rang in Arthur's flat. It was a scratchy line, a reporter from the music magazine, breathless, asking if Arthur knew anything about a tape they'd received. Arthur, with a practiced nonchalance that belied the tremor in his hands, simply said he'd heard whispers, rumors, like everyone else. He feigned ignorance, a slight smile playing on his lips as he hung up. The magazine ran a small piece, tucked away on an inside page, speculating about the origins of the mysterious tape, and praising its haunting beauty. The Manchester DJ played it one rainy Tuesday night, a brief, poignant interlude between heavier tracks, and spoke with a reverence that made Alara's eyes well up. It wasn't a phenomenon, not a chart topper, but it was heard. It was enough. Marcus Thorne, of course, raged. His calls to Arthur were frequent, laced with thinly veiled threats and desperate pleas. He knew it was the tape, he insisted, he could feel it, but without the full recording, without any proof of its source, he had no leverage, no legal claim. He accused Arthur of sabotage, of hiding millions. Arthur simply listened, occasionally offering a clipped, polite denial, then hung up, the receiver heavy in his hand. Alara, listening from the kitchen as she made them tea, could hear the frustration in Marcus's voice through the thin walls. He was a shark denied his prey, circling, but ultimately powerless. The game, for now, was over. The original reel-to-reel tape, the true, raw document of a band's final breath, was carefully placed back into its wooden box, then wrapped in an old, moth-eaten blanket and tucked away in the deepest corner of Arthur's wardrobe, beneath stacks of faded jumpers and forgotten scarves. It was a secret shared, a burden carried, a sacred trust. They often spoke of returning it to the surviving members, or their estates, but the conversation always ended with a quiet sigh. The pain was still too fresh, the wounds too deep. Perhaps one day, they conceded, but not yet. The music, in its entirety, remained a private lament. Alara found herself staying longer in London than she had ever intended. Her job, her life in Liverpool, seemed distant, almost unreal. She found a temporary flat in a converted Victorian house not far from Arthur's, the rent surprisingly affordable. Her initial ambition, once a burning, singular focus, had softened, replaced by a deeper understanding, a quiet empathy for the lives behind the music. She spent her days poring over old music papers in dusty archives, piecing together the narrative of the band, not for profit, but for knowledge, for closure. Arthur, in turn, found himself less isolated. Their evenings often consisted of quiet dinners in his flat, sometimes just a simple meal, sometimes a takeaway from the local Chinese. They would talk for hours or sit in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly in the background. One evening, as the rain pattered against the windowpane, Alara confessed, her voice barely a whisper, that she had once dreamed of making a fortune from the tape. Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flickering gas fire. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "We all have our dreams, don't we? Some of them just changed shape. He looked at her then, his eyes, usually so guarded, soft with a shared understanding. You could have done it, you know. You had the drive. Alara shook her head, a small, wry smile touching her lips. Perhaps, but it wouldn't have felt right. Not anymore. She paused, then added, "It was you, Arthur. You reminded me what really mattered. The music, the people." Arthur looked away, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. He cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose someone had to keep an old man honest." There was a flicker of the old, dry humor in his eyes, but it was tempered with a warmth she hadn't seen before. The regret he carried, the decades of suppressed pain, still lingered, a shadow in the corners of his eyes, but it was now mixed with a quiet peace, a sense of having finally done right by his friends. Their connection had deepened, evolving into something unspoken but profound. It wasn't the fiery passion of youth, but a quiet, enduring affection, born of shared struggle and a profound mutual respect. They were two disparate souls, one an old man haunted by ghosts, the other a young woman searching for meaning, brought together by a secret, bound by a promise. They often visited George Davies in Cornwall, making the long train journey to his cliff-edge cottage. George, frail but still sharp, would greet them with a wide, toothless grin, and they would spend hours reminiscing, the old man's stories weaving new threads into their understanding of the past. He'd even, on one occasion, tried to teach Alara how to mend a fishing net, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. She was hopeless, but the laughter echoed across the sea. One crisp autumn afternoon, weeks after the small snippet had made its quiet journey through the airwaves, Alara sat across from Arthur in his living room. The scent of wood polish and old books hung in the air. She watched him as he carefully cleaned the lens of his old camera, a ritual he performed almost daily. The light from the window caught the silver in his hair, the lines etched around his eyes. He looked up, catching her gaze. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I was thinking about that night, all those years ago. The last time I saw them all together." He paused, his eyes distant. "It was a mess, really. But there were moments. Just moments when the music, it just took over. Like nothing else mattered." He smiled faintly. "I suppose that's what we tried to save, isn't it? Those moments." Alara nodded, her own eyes a little misty. "We did, Arthur." She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before gently covering his, resting on the back of his hand as he held the camera. His skin was surprisingly warm. He didn't pull away. "You'll stay, then?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. She looked at him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "For a while yet," she said. I think I've finally found my rhythm." He nodded slowly, a deep, contented sigh escaping him. The afternoon sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows across the room, painting the walls in hues of gold and amber. The quiet hum of the city outside, a distant, familiar murmur, seemed to hold them in its embrace. The reel-to-reel tape, hidden away in the wardrobe, remained silent, its secrets kept, its echo lingering, a testament to what was lost, and what, unexpectedly, had been found. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story.